Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. Thank you so much for coming back after we spoke last week about the 5 men of Rivonia, excluding Mandela, Sisulu, and Mbeki. It's always so interesting to see how people get to the point of resistance and what they did to get to armed resistance, and then obviously what happened at the trial and after. Today, I wanted to give these 3 people, these 3 South Africans, their flowers. Before I go into the script, I wanted to really talk about a connection that comes through seeing photos. The one person who I knew, which is Albertina Sisulu, whenever I see a photo of her, I think warmth, great hug, caring. I've never seen her in person, but that is what I got from looking at photos of her. Then with Neville Alexander and Alex La Guma, there was a connection, almost like, do I know you? Have I seen you before? I know we all get that with some people. And then went into their lives and went to look at who they were, why they were important for the freedoms that we see today. And I really wanted to give that moment to them because I did not know them. It was just a recognition of someone who looked like someone who, I don't know if I'm explaining this correctly, but I hope you understand where I was feeling when I saw these people. And then finding out about them connected me more to who they were. Let's get into the episode and learn about these wonderful people. Okay. Don't forget to subscribe and like and come back every week and interact with us on the platforms. Thank you so much for those who have joined us in the last couple of weeks. When we think of resistance, we often imagine confrontation, marches, slogan, clenched fist, gunfire. But apartheid was not defeated by force alone. It was weakened day by day by ideas, by care, and by stories. This is the story of 3 South Africans who did not lead armies, but who changed how people thought, how people survived, and how the world understood apartheid. Neville Alexander, the revolutionary intellectual who believed language could free a nation. Albertina Sisulu, the nurse who became the backbone of resistance. And Alex La Guma, the novelist who smuggled truth across borders. Different lives, different tools, one enemy. Alexander arrived at resistance through thought, Sisulu through care, and Laguma through imagination. Apartheid would punish all 3 with prison, banning orders, exile, and surveillance. But first, each would make a choice to step fully into opposition. Neville Alexander was born in 1936 in Cape Town's District 6, a place of multilingual vibrancy and racial mixing that apartheid would later obliterate, raze to the ground. He grew up hearing Afrikaans, English, and Xhosa. Language was not theory, it was daily life. At school, Alexander was exceptional, academically gifted, curious, restless. At the University of Cape Town, he studied German philosophy and literature, Marx, Brecht, and Goethe. What struck him early was this: language is never neutral. Apartheid ruled not only through police, but through classification, naming, and education. Very, very important. That we recognize that those were devastating parts, which was together with the violence. Alexander would later say, if you control how people speak, you control how they imagine their futures. Politics for him began in the classroom. The apartheid state feared guns, but it feared ideas more. Guns could be outlawed, people could be jailed, borders could be sealed. Ideas once absorbed could not be confiscated unless you want to talk about what is the spotless mind thing? The eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. unless you want to do that type of thing. Go. And this is why Neville Alexander mattered. He did not command soldiers. He did not lead mass rallies. What he challenged was something deeper. How South Africans understood themselves. Alexander arrived at the University of Cape Town at a time when apartheid ideology was being systemized academically, linguistically, administratively. He excelled in German literature and philosophy, as we spoke about. But he refused to treat theory as abstraction. For Alexander, theory was a tool. He began asking questions few dared to pose. Why did apartheid insist on ethnic languages rather than shared ones? Why were African languages deliberately underdeveloped in education? And why did Afrikaans function as both culture and weapon? His conclusion was blunt. Apartheid is a linguistic project as well as a political one. This insight would define his life. In the early 1960s, Alexander helped form the National Liberation Front, a small but intellectually radical organization. Unlike other movements, NLF rejected racial nationalism. Alexander argued that apartheid's categories were traps, even when used by the oppressed. He insisted on non-racialism, not as slogan, but as structure. This made him dangerous. The state preferred resistance it could classify. Alexander refused classification. In 1964, Alexander was arrested. He was charged under the Sabotage Act. Where have we seen this before? But here the evidence was thin, but the sentence was heavy. 10 years on Robben Island. Alexander later said, I was not imprisoned for what I had done. I was imprisoned for what I represented. Ideas outlasting regimes. So let's talk about this prosecution of Neville Alexander. I really wanted to understand when I went and I started looking at this, what did the state claim? What did they present? But what was the facts? So the state claimed that the Uchi Chan Club, again, something that came out of nowhere, known as the National Liberation Front, was a secret revolutionary organization. It was inspired by Maoist guerrilla theory. Its purpose was to prepare for violent overthrowing of the state. So what did they present? Notes and documents discussing revolutionary theory, study materials referencing guerrilla warfare, testimony that Alexander was a leading intellectual figure in the group. The reality was that the club was primarily a political education and study circle. No operation military wing existed. No acts of sabotage had been carried out by the group. So the state treated political study as criminal conspiracy. So about those seized documents and writing, the state prosecution relied heavily on these notes discussing the armed struggle, draft pamphlets and internal discussion papers, theoretical writings about revolution, class struggle, and colonialism. They produced translations and interpretations of Alexander's writing, excerpts taken out of context, and emphasis on phrasing suggesting future violence. Again, the reality of this that they were theoretical, preparatory text. There were no dates, there were no plans, there were no targets or logistics that were identified. No weapons caches or operational instructions were found. So thinking about resistance was equated with committing sabotage. Then this assertion that they were planning guerrilla warfare, looking at Maoist, if you don't know, Chairman Mao from China, guerrilla tactics. The state accused Alexander and others of planning guerrilla warfare and intending to sabotage infrastructure in the future. So what did they present? They said they reference Mao Zedong, which is Chairman Mao, and other revolutionary thinkers, notes on the concept of rural guerrilla warfare, and testimony from police experts on revolutionary movements. The reality was there was no evidence of training camps. There was no weapons. There was no reconnaissance of targets. There was no funding channels. What they then are saying is that intent was inferred entirely from ideology, not action. Then the other thing they just chucked in the mix was that Alexander was not directly, but indirectly linked to the banned ANC and international communist movements. They presented overlaps in the documents and the language and analysis and internationally revolutionary text in his possession. Alexander was not a member of the ANC. His politics were independent and intellectually grounded. There's no direct operational link that was proven. So association replaced proof. This is the most important point. What the state did not have: no explosions, no damaged infrastructure, no weapons, no casualties, no eyewitnesses to acts of sabotage. Their case was built on the anticipation of future resistance, criminalization of political intent, and punishment for intellectual leadership. So the Sabotage Act, as I've spoken about before, was deliberately vague. It allowed conviction if the state could argue that someone intended to endanger law and order or intended to disrupt the state at any future point. This made thought crimes prosecutable, but he wasn't thinking about committing a crime. He was just understanding and educating himself. He was convicted, as I said, sentenced to 10 years on Robben Island. He served alongside our Rivonia trialists. This was despite the fact that he never committed sabotage, never possessed a weapon, and never led an armed operation. And historians widely agree. The case was political, not criminal. The evidence could not meet basic legal standards in a democratic system. Alexander was imprisoned because he posed a long-term ideological threat, not an immediate security one. Alexander himself later described the trial as an attempt to criminalize the future. So, we've seen this in many of these trials or many of these moments that we look at people being suppressed through these different acts. But what this trial and this sabotage trial shows us is how apartheid used law to suppress ideas, how intellectual resistance was treated as violent threat, and why Robben Island held thinkers as well as fighters. He said, and he later reflected on his time at Robben Island, where he was respected not because he was loud, but because he was rigorous. He said that prison does not only test your courage, but it tests your thinking. And he left Robben Island sharpened. He entered the prison as a radical thinker, and he left with something more dangerous: a lifelong commitment to education as liberation. Thank you for you. History often remembers resistance as something that happens in public, on streets, in courtrooms, in exile. But apartheid also fought a domestic war, a war on homes, on mothers, on care itself. And in the quiet, relentless battlefield stood Albertina Sisulu. She did not lead armies. She did not write manifestos. She held life together while the state tried to tear it apart. Albertina Nonsekilelo Sisulu, it's a very nice name, was born in 1918 in the rural Transkei. She trained as a nurse, one of the few professions open to Black women. But nursing under apartheid meant more than medicine, a profession chosen not out of ambition necessity. Under apartheid, nursing was political whether you wanted it to be or not. She treated malnutrition caused by migrant labor or caused by forced removals, injuries from police violence, children traumatized by raids and removals, caring for children of detained parents, and working in clinics stripped of resources. Albertina saw apartheid in bodies, not slogans. She would later say, "I did not need politics explained to me. I saw it every day in the clinic." Albertina did not enter politics through ideology. She entered it through suffering she could not ignore. When she married Walter Sisulu, politics became unavoidable. But even then, she did not become his shadow. She became indispensable. A home turned into a meeting place. A nurse turned into an organizer. A mother turned into a movement's anchor. She would later say, "We did not choose politics. Politics chose us." Their home at Orlando West became a meeting place, a refuge, a target. When Walter was detained, banned, imprisoned, Albertina became both parents, both organizers, both pillars. She joined the ANC Women's League. She helped organize the 1956 Women's March. And when the men were jailed en masse, women did not support the struggle. They became the struggle. Albertina Sisulu was banned for 18 years. 18 years of house arrest, police surveillance, night raids, and travel restrictions. She was the most banned woman in South Africa, yet she continued. She raised children, ran a household, organized quietly, protected others. When asked how she endured, she replied simply, I love this. There was no choice. If we stopped, everything would stop. Her resistance was not dramatic. It was relentless. By the late 1980s, Albertina Sisulu had become more than an activist. She was moral infrastructure. I love that. Younger activists trusted her. Communities deferred to her. The state feared her steadiness. She rejected the idea of heroism. She once said, "I was not brave, I was responsible." She did not defeat apartheid with words or weapons. She defeated it by making survival look possible. Alex La Guma was born in 1925 in Cape Town into politics. His father, Jimmy Laguma, was a trade unionist and communist. For Alex, injustice was not discovered, it was inherited. He worked as a journalist, absorbing the textures of working class life, dock workers, factory laborers, and tenant dwellers. He saw apartheid not as an abstraction, but as daily violence. Laguma began to write fiction not to escape reality, but to trap it on the page. He believed stories could cross borders that activists could not, and they did. Politics was not an ideology discussed at dinner. It was survival. He saw how apartheid functioned, not just as law, but as daily erosion. He would later write, "Oppression is first felt in the stomach, then in the spirit." His novels depicted police raids, poverty, fear, quiet resilience. Works like A Walk in the Night and In the Fog of the Season's End were not sentimental. They were forensic, and the apartheid government or state understood the danger. His books were banned. But the stories traveled anyway, smuggled abroad, read internationally, translated into multiple languages. Laguma became one of apartheid's most effective witnesses. He lived under constant surveillance, his movements restricted, his speech monitored, his livelihood threatened. But writing continued, quietly, relentlessly. He once remarked, "They can silence the writer, they cannot silence the story." Eventually, the pressure became unbearable, and he went into exile in 1965. London, then Havana. Exile gave him safety, but it took something else, proximity. Distance sharpened his political clarity, but it also deepened longing. He served as an ANC representative in Cuba, continuing the struggle diplomatically, and he died in exile in 1985 before seeing liberation. A man who told the world what apartheid was never lived to see it full. Alex La Guma did not dismantle apartheid with laws or negotiation. He dismantled its lies. Apartheid did not always need executions. It perfected slow punishment, prison, exile, banning, isolation, economic strangulation. Its aim was not simply to silence resistance, but to make resistance unsustainable. And yet, 3 lives endured differently, stubbornly. For Neville Alexander, on Robben Island, men were flattened into numbers. He became a classroom without walls. He debated fiercely not for dominance but clarity. He taught languages. He refined his critique of racial thinking. Even inside prison, Alexander resisted categorization. He argued that apartheid's greatest trick was convincing people to internalize racial identities. Absolutely. He would later say, if the oppressor defines the terms of struggle, the struggle has already been narrowed. Prison sharpened his belief that liberation without intellectual decolonization would be incomplete, and I 100% agree. Albertina did not go into exile. She did not disappear into prison. She lived under a microscope. Her banning orders restricted her movement, speech, and association. These cars parked outside her home. Phones were tapped. Visitors were noted. And yet the house remained open. She once remarked, "They wanted to make me afraid in my own home, but fear could not raise my children." Her endurance made resistance livable for others. Exile protected Alex La Guma's body, but it strained his spirit. Writing from abroad meant remembering through distance. He continued to publish, to speak, and to represent the ANC. But exile is never neutral. It freezes time, it stretches longing, and it sharpens grief. La Guma died in exile, a witness who never crossed home again. Prison tests the mind, surveillance tests the spirit, and exile tests belonging. Alexander survived through ideas, Sisulu through care, and La Guma through memory. Apartheid failed because it could not defeat all 3. The state tried to isolate them. Instead, it revealed something enduring. That resistance does not look the same for everyone, but it endures when rooted in purpose. When apartheid formally ended, South Africa celebrated a miracle, but freedom does not arrive with instructions. Definitely didn't. The men and women who had resisted in different ways now face a subtler challenge. How do you live after resistance when resistance has shaped your entire identity? It's a very, very poignant question. For Neville Alexander, Albertina Sisulu, and Alex La Guma, the answer was not power, it was principle. After prison, Neville Alexander did not seek office. He returned to education. He warned early that political freedom without linguistic and economic justice would reproduce inequality in new forms. He was not wrong. He criticized elite capture of democracy, the dominance of English, and the abandonment of African languages in school. He argued, if democracy speaks only one language, it will only listen to one class. His critiques made him respected and inconvenient. He remained an outsider by choice. History might yet prove he was early. And I agree with everything he said because we see that playing out. Albertina Sisulu entered democracy as she had entered the struggle without entitlement. She served in Parliament briefly, then stepped back. She never used sacrifice as leverage, never traded endurance for privilege. When called the mother of the nation, she accepted the title quietly but corrected its meaning. She said, "I am not the mother of South Africa. I am one of many women who refuse to let it die." Her legacy was not policy. It is example. Alex La Guma did not live to see freedom, but freedom arrived carrying his words. His novels are now studied, quoted, and reclaimed. They remind us that apartheid was not only brutal, it was intimate. It lived in kitchens, in streets, in hostels, in homes. Laguma ensured the world would never say we did not know. From Neville Alexander, we learn ideas matter, and neglecting them has consequences. From Albertina Sisulu, we learn care is political and survival is resistance. From Alex La Guma, we learn stories shape memory and memory shapes justice. Together, they leave us a warning. Freedom without thought becomes hollow. Freedom without care becomes cruel. And freedom without memory becomes dishonest. Alexander asks us to think more deeply. Sisulu asks us to care more fiercely. And Laguma asks us to remember more truthfully. None of them believed liberation was the end. They believed it was a responsibility. And the question they leave us is not historical. It is present. Are we still willing to think, still willing to care, still willing to tell the truth, even when it is uncomfortable? Because freedom unattended does not disappear overnight. It erodes. Thank you for joining me and talking about these three individuals who I hold in such great esteem. And it was amazing learning about them and what they stood for and how they stood up for the people and themselves. It was amazing to retell that, and I hope you found their stories as interesting and as thought-provoking as it did to me. We are all connected in some way or another, and connecting to the past always feels like it is a throw to the future, because the ideas and what they spoke about and how they spoke, very relevant today in the South Africa that we live in today. Please subscribe, press that like button if you love this episode, and comment below if you have any questions or if you enjoyed it. And I'll see you guys next week. Thank you and bye-bye.